Let's open up our Bibles once again to the book of 1 Samuel as we find ourselves here in chapter 22. Now, you remember last time we were together in chapter 21. David, he was beginning to lose hope. David was in a decline spiritually. And we're going to go through those kinds of seasons. And probably many of you, if you've been followers of Christ for any length of time at all, you know that you can go through these deep valleys where your faith is being challenged, where it seems like somehow God has forgotten you. You run into health problems, you run into marriage problems and problems with your children and financial problems. And you're praying and it just seems like heaven is brass. It just seems like your prayers are just bouncing off of the ceiling above you. And that's where David was at. David was living wisely. Over and over again, we were told that as he was serving Saul, he was faithful, he was wise, he was keeping his nose clean, he was doing everything that he knew that was right, and yet at the end of the day, he was still struggling, and he was still, being burdened and being attacked and being lied about, and, he's a young guy. I mean, he's in his early 20s, and it just seemed like the weight of the world was upon him, and you know what it's like when it doesn't seem like God is moving on your behalf, that you finally say, all right, God's not going to take care of business. I'm going to take care of business, right? And he takes matters into his own hands, and he just ends up in a very dark and very horrible place where we left him off last time in chapter 21. Now in chapter 22, because look, God is faithful. Even when we are without faith, God remains faithful. He cannot deny who he is. He is the faithful God, and he's going to be faithful to you, and he's going to keep you, and he's going to preserve you. And we may wonder, but yet the Lord, in his grace and his mercy, he's going to bring us back. And so David now is going to be brought back. He's going to be getting his spiritual strength and stamina back here in chapter 22. Now, he ends up in a cave of Adullam. And in the cave of Adullam, we have two Psalms that he wrote at this time. He writes Psalm 57 and he writes Psalm 142. And in Psalm 57, beginning in verse 1, when he fled from Saul into the cave, "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me. For my soul trusts in you, and in the shadow of your wings, I will make my refuge until these calamities pass." You see, he's starting to come back now. He's remembering God. Yes, God is going to be merciful. God's going to take care of me. I don't see light at the end of the tunnel yet, but I know that God is going to be faithful. And then in Psalm 142, he writes a contemplation of David, a prayer when he was in the cave. "I cry out to the Lord with my voice, my voice to the Lord, I make my supplication." Then in verses 4 and 5, he writes, "Look on my right hand and see, for there is no one who acknowledges me. Refuge has failed me. No one cares for my soul. I cry out unto you, O Lord. I said, you are my refuge, my portion in the land of the living." Hey, this guy has been abandoned by everybody. Here he sits in this cave by himself. But he remembers God, and God is with me. God's going to take care of me. And so hope now begins to come back to David. Now, not only is hope coming unto David, but now David begins to see a few people showing up to be great encouragers to him. Well, let's begin in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 22. "Now David, therefore, he departed from there." Now that would be the city of Gath, the hometown of Goliath, where he very foolishly went. So David, therefore he departed from there, from Gath, and he escaped, right? He escaped with his life, unto the cave of Adullam. And then when his brothers, and now notice all of his families, all of his father's house heard it. So this would be his dad's side of the family. So his uncles and, his dad's brothers, all of those guys, they showed up. And they went down there to him. Now, David has had an eventful last several days, hasn't he? All of this journey began in Gibeah. And Gibeah was living there with his wife. And you remember that his wife said, "Hey, baby, you gotta get out of here. And if you stay here one moment longer, my dad got bad guys watching the front door. And you got to get out, because I would rather you be alive and lost in the wilderness than dead in my presence, right? So you got to get out. And so she made some sort of a rope, let him out of that upper story back window, and he runs for it. And you remember that he ended up in the town of Nob, and Nob is where the tabernacle was at. And he said to the priest, look, you got to give me some food. I'm starving here. And so the priest gave him some food. And then you remember he said, do you have a weapon? And he said, well, we got Goliath's sword. And you remember that David said, oh man, give that to me. There is none like it. I mean, that was an incredible sword. And then, again, as he takes the issues of his life into his own strength, and we do this when we swerve into unbelief, when we begin to question God's goodness, we're going to end up making just horrible choices for ourselves. And the horrible choice that he made was to go to the town of Gath. And as I say, their hometown hero was Goliath. Now, David said concerning his sword, there's none like it. This is the one and only on the entire planet. And everybody knew what Goliath's sword looked like. And now you got the guy that killed Goliath walking down Main Street of Goliath's hometown with Goliath's sword strapped to his side. What kind of an imbecile are we dealing with? Well, this is what unbelief does. Unbelief will cause you to make some of the dumbest choices you've ever made in your life. You get panicked, you get filled with fear, you get filled with depression, you get filled with anxiety. You start making choices. You're being led by your flesh instead of being led by the Spirit. You're going to end up doing dumb things. And oh, what a foolish, dumb thing David did that we read about last time. But now he begins to recover, he escapes, and he ends up in Adullam. Now, he would have been very familiar with Adullam. Adullam is just slightly west of Bethlehem. Now, remember, his job in the family is that he took care of the flock. He took care of the family sheep. And they raise sheep much differently than what we do. I mean, here, we get a lot of rain. And so, you're going to put your sheep in the back 40 acres, and they're going to chew that down. And then you're going to move them up to the front 40 acres, and they're going to chew that down. And then you're going to move them back to the back 40. Well, they don't get that kind of moisture there in the region here of the Negev, this southern part of Israel. So a shepherd's going to constantly be moving that flock around. And you're going to find a little bit of grazing pasture here. And then you're going to move them over here, and you're going to find a little bit there. And so David was very familiar with this territory. This is his old stomping ground. Now, Adullam is a very barren kind of a place. There's all kinds of caves that are there. And apparently there was one particular cave that he was fond of. It was some degree of comfort. And that's where he ends up. Now, notice that his family comes there, and his family has figured out, well, not only is the youngest son in trouble with the king, but the entire family is going to be in danger. If Saul was willing to kill his own family, what in the world is he going to do with the family of David? And so they quite quickly figure out, we got to be on the run for it as well. Now, not only does the family show up, notice who else shows up there in this cave is getting very crowded, by the way. Notice verse 2. And everyone who was, get a load of this, in distress, everyone that was in debt, everyone who was discontented, gathered. Now, do we have any people like that here today, right? Debt and discontented, and boy, you're under distress. So they gathered to him, so that he became then the captain over them. And there were about 400 men with him. Now, you talk about a motley crew that is gathering together now to this king that is anointed. Now, this is not the A team, all right? This is the D team, right? Those under distress and debt and discontented. Now, we have to understand that this is a picture of something that's going to develop in the New Testament. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 11, Jesus famously said, "Come unto me, all of you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. For I am gentle and lowly of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." How many of us, under the stress of living the dumb lives that we were living, we turn to the King that is in exile, and now he has become our captain? Alan Redpath, he says it this way: "Do you see the truth of which this Old Testament story is so graphic a picture? That just as in David's day, there is a king in exile who is gathering around him a company of people who are in distress and debt and discontented, and he is training and preparing them for the day when he shall come and reign." And so, look, there are two kingdoms. There is the kingdom of darkness. It is ruled by an illegitimate king. It is ruled by one who is usurping his authority over this planet. The genuine king, the real king, is in exile. This is what Paul said to the Corinthians, that look, Christ reigns, but we don't see that yet. We see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, suffered and died. That's what we see. We only see that side of the story. But the story will one day be revealed, where those eastern skies are going to split wide open, where John says he saw the sky being ripped open, and here is the King and his golden city, and that is what we are waiting on. Now, the real question is, well, what kingdom are you a part of? Are you a part of the kingdom of light? Are you a part of the kingdom of death and darkness? And if you find that you're in that kingdom of death and darkness, oh, how the love of Christ woos us, that we would come into that kingdom of light, and that we would bring our debt, we would bring our discontentment, we would bring all of the stress of life, and we would just pour it out upon our King. Now notice in verse 3 that David, he went there from Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, now please, let my father and mother. Now this is interesting. This is the only time in Scripture that we find David's mother being mentioned. So we know very little about her and what tribe she came from. But please, let my father and my mother come here with you until I know what God will do for me. Now, he knows that he's king, but how long is that going to take? Is that going to take another 20 years? Is it 15 years? I mean, how long is this journey that David is on? Now, the first thing that we see the man of God do is that the man of God takes care of his family. There is a family obligation that every man of God is responsible for. I always find it so very curious how you'll see some guy develop such an interest for the foreign mission field, and he allows his own family to languish. He has a greater interest reaching families on the other side of the planet than he does really taking care of his own family. Again, you look at Timothy, you look at Titus, you look at how Paul lays out what are the requirements for a guy that has an interest in being a leader in the church. The very first requirement is that you have been faithful in your family and you have been taking care of your family. And so here's David. David recognized, look, I'm not going to be effective on the battlefield if I have concern for my family in the back of my mind. I got to make sure that they are going to be well taken care of. I got them off of my radar. They're well taken care of in Moab. And so he says, now, please take care of my mother and father and my family. Now, it would appear, and again, the chronology of all of this is very difficult to figure out. We can't say very dogmatically how long David was here and how long David was there, but it does seem that he's in this stronghold for a period of time, because we have this very unfamiliar prophet by the name of Gad. And this would be a good Bible trivia question, what prophet came to David in Moab, because this guy is just mentioned and then he's dropped off the pages of Scripture. And so this guy by the name of Gad says to him, hey, bro, God has not called you to be the king of Moab. He's called you to be the king of Israel. So get your rear end back to Israel. It would appear that maybe David is just taking a path of least resistance. I'm just going to hang out here. I mean, I don't know what's really going to go on. I'll just maybe wait here until Saul dies of old age. But rarely are lessons learned when we are hiding out. Lessons are learned and maturity is brought to us when we get into the fray, when we get into the battle, when we get into these pressure situations. This is where God reveals himself. This is how God trains us. This is how God prepares us. And basically, the prophet is saying, get your butt into the battle. Get over there. God's not done teaching you. You're not yet prepared for the throne. There's more education in your future. And so you've got to expose yourself now to some of this difficulty and some of this hardship. Now, apparently now Saul has got very good military intel because Saul is discovering that there is a trickle of guys that are making their way to David. This insurrection is growing. And so this narcissistic, paranoid man realizes that his problem is only growing worse. And when you have a narcissistic individual that is under pressure, one of the things that you will always see coming out of them is blame for everybody around them. And that is exactly what happens. Notice in verse 8 now, he's got all of his servants there around him. And he says to them, now all of you have conspired against me. And there is no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. Check this out. I love this. And there is no one of you, notice, who feel sorry for me. Oh, you poor baby. We all feel sorry for you, Saul. And he says that for you, for me, or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait to this day. This big ball baby, he is just, again, this is a man who has attempted to kill innocent people. I mean, this is not a good guy. This is a horrible human being that is consumed with himself. And when we are consumed with ourselves, it just puts that filter on us and we look at everybody else is the problem. No, dude, you're the problem. This is the guy that disobeyed God. This is a guy that Samuel said, look, the Lord's going to rip the kingdom from you. It's nobody else's fault but his own. But when we allow ourselves to get to that place where we refuse to take blame, where we refuse to take responsibility, we then begin to blame everybody else. It's my wife's fault. It's my parents' fault. It's my boss's fault. It's my kids' fault. It's the world's fault. No, it's your fault. Own it. And once you begin to own it, God then has something to work with. But until we're ready to get to that place where we accept, look, I have blown it, Lord. I am so sorry. Please forgive me. Until we get to that point, there is nothing that you're giving God to work with. And so he begins to go off on all of these guys. Nobody cares about me and nobody likes me. And, woe is me. And now you remember Doeg. Remember that guy that we were introduced to last week? Doeg, you remember, he's got an ace in the game. Now, when you have an ace, you need to play it very wisely. You don't want to waste your ace. And so Doeg, he's been holding on to this ace for a few days. And Doeg realizes now is the time to use it because he's just thrown all of his servants under the bus. And now is the time for me to shine and gain real position before the king. And so Doeg, he says to Saul, hey, I got a bit of information that you're going to want to hear. I saw David hanging out with Ahimelech, the priest. And the priest gave him bread, gave him a weapon, and the priest was seeking God on his behalf. And finally, Saul was like, finally, Finally, I've got some information here that I can really use. And so he calls the priest. He calls the priest up there and is going to examine, right, if Doeg's story is genuine. And notice in verse 13, that then Saul said unto him, the priest, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me? You see, everything is about him. Everything's about his welfare. To lie in wait, notice, as it is this day, right? When there is that unwillingness to examine yourself, look, judge yourself. Judge yourself. Look, that person that you're angry with, are they going to stand before God and give an account? Yeah, they're going to stand and give an account before God. So are you. So am I. And so therefore, how are we going to be better served? By just examining everybody else and figuring out what's wrong with everybody else? Or are we going to be better served if we get real and genuine before God? This is who I am. This is what I'm struggling with. This is what I need your help on. Saul was not there, and that is why Saul is going to crash and burn. One of the reasons why you see so many men crash and burn is because of the pride of life and the unwillingness to be real before the Lord. And so he says, now, why have you stabbed me in the back? Now, look at this. Now, notice the priest, he fires right back at him. I mean, this priest has got some backbone. And this priest said, well, why in the world wouldn't I help the guy? All right, here I am, just doing what I do at the tabernacle, and one of your commanding officers shows up at my front door, looking rather disheveled, by the way, and he needs food, and he needs a weapon. This is a man who has served you faithfully. This is a guy that has always carried out your orders to the very letter. Why in the world would I not help this guy? Because from my perspective, helping him is ultimately helping you. What is your problem? Well, of course, Saul doesn't like hearing that. And Saul turns to his servants and he says, look, kill this guy and kill all of these priests. Now, these servants of Saul, they're like, whoa, wait, we're very uncomfortable with the idea of killing the priests of the Lord. So notice what happens in verse 18. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priest. And so Doeg the Edomite, he turned and he struck the priests and he killed on that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod, wiped out 85 of these priests. And also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword. Now notice, both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. And here Saul is putting his evil on display. It's interesting that Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, he writes about this, and he says, Doeg killed Ahimelech and all of his family, who were in all 385. Now, notice that when evil runs rampant, that what evil loves to do is to destroy innocence. They even destroyed the nursing babies. When you saw the events of October 7th of this year, you saw evil on display with its bloodlust for the innocents. The enemy of our faith hates us. The enemy of our faith wants to destroy even the most innocent among us. And you will see that evil on display, not just with a terrorist, but with men and women who wear black robes. There are men and women in positions of authority wearing black robes that hate children and enjoy spilling the blood of children. Maybe you saw this little girl. This is Indy Gregory. Well, was Indy Gregory. 8-month-old little baby girl, very serious health problems in the UK. And Britain's health authority said to the parents, we are going to unplug her from life support. Now, this is why you don't want socialized medicine. I know that our healthcare system in this country is messed up right now, but I'm telling you, you don't want socialized medicine because mom and dad will lose their parental rights under that system. And the British system said, the parents gave pushback. No, don't unplug our child. The British system said, she's not yours. She's in our system. We're going to do with her what we want to do. The Vatican contacted the British government and said, please allow us to come and get this little girl. We will pay for all of the expenses. We will fly her back to Italy, and we will put her and take care of her in one of our children's hospitals. The Prime Minister of Italy said, we are granting her Italian citizenship, and we'll pay for everything. You're off the hook. Just let the little girl live. And men and women in black robes said, no, we're going to kill this child. She was supposed to be killed tomorrow, but they just couldn't wait, and they killed her yesterday. There is evil in the world that wants to destroy children. Jesus says, please allow the children to come unto me. One of the greatest things that we can do in fulfilling the will of Christ is for us to continue to bring children to Him, that they would be blessed and grow up under His lordship. Well, this evil was spreading now in Israel. And what's interesting is that one of the priests got away, a guy by the name of Abiathar. And we close in verse 21. Notice this, and Abiathar, he escaped, and he told David that Saul had killed all of the priests. And so David said to Abiathar, I knew that day. Oh, I knew it. When Doeg the Edomite was there, I just knew that guy, that he would surely tell Saul. And isn't this interesting? I have caused the death of all of the persons of your father's house. I'm the one, I bear responsibility. I killed your entire family. Now, David didn't kill him, of course. It was Saul, it was Doeg that killed him. But David recognizes that it was really his fault. He should have used greater wisdom. But notice he says, now you stay with me and do not fear. For he that seeks my life seeks your life. But with me you shall be safe. Right? Now, it's interesting that David accepts the responsibility. Now, not only does he accept responsibility, but he then also takes steps to rectify the situation. You see, it's one thing for a person to say, well, gee, I'm sorry. And there's genuine sadness on their part. They really are sorry that they've caused us some kind of harm. But then there's that desire to just sweep it under the rug, forget about all of this, and just move on with the rest of our life. Now, that's one thing. That's one way to deal with the problem. Another way is to say to the person, look, I'm deeply sorry for what I have done, and I will spend the rest of my life making up for the harm that I have caused you. See, that reveals a different kind of heart, doesn't it? When a person says, I will move heaven and hell to make sure that I make this up to you. And so here is David simply saying to this guy, look, I'm responsible for the death of your family, but I guarantee you, your life is going to be spared. And you stay with me, and if I have to give my life for your life, that is what I am willing to do. You see, that reveals brokenness. And this is a classic study between these two kings. It's a classic study between these two men. One man refuses to be broken. One man refuses to come to the end of himself. David, though, accepts responsibility. David owns his mistake. David owns his mistake. This is all on me. Again, brokenness. Brokenness is on display when men stop justifying themselves. Yes, I did this, but I've got a good reason why. They said this, and they wrote this, and they did this. No, that's not brokenness. Brokenness is what we see in the tax collector that went up to pray with the Pharisee, and the tax collector would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat on his chest almost to say, this is the problem. The problem is my heart. And not even wanting to look up to heaven, he said, Lord, have mercy on my soul. And Jesus said that dude walked away from that prayer meeting justified before God. Why? Because he was a broken man. He was accepting what he was, and he was just laying it all before the Lord. Brokenness is on display when the mouth is shut. You show me a man that keeps running his mouth, and I'll show you a man that is not broken. You show me a man that says, have mercy on me, O God, a sinner, and then he shuts his mouth. That is a guy that is broken, and that is a guy that is ready to be elevated by the Spirit of God, and God is going to do a great work in his life. And so I think that as we go to prayer tonight, we need to pray that we would walk humbly before the Lord, that we would allow his Spirit to bring us to the end of ourselves, that we would recognize that in us, that is in our flesh, there dwells no good thing, and that we would just humbly plead to heaven that the Lord would do his work in and through us. As Jesus in Matthew chapter 11 said, look, I am lowly and I am meek. That is the same kind of lifestyle in the same way that we are to live our lives as well. Oh, the pride of life is just under the surface, isn't it? And we need to pray that, oh, God would give us victory. And Lord, we would ask that as we leave here tonight, that Lord, your Spirit will continue to just ever cultivate in each of our hearts just that Christ-likeness. That here he was in the form of God. He didn't think it was robbery to be equal with God. Didn't think he was taking anything that didn't belong to him. But he emptied himself and he humbled himself all the way to the cross. Father, there is this monster of pride that resides in each of our hearts. We just desire to be noticed. We desire to be seen. We desire to be famous. Lord, I pray that our one desire would be to make Jesus Christ famous, and that we would walk humbly before you, allowing you to do that eternal work in and through us. How we thank you for our heavenly David, who has allowed the likes of us, the distressed, those who are in debt, those who are discontented, to make our way into his army. And Father, may he continue to train and develop us into the men and women that you desire us to be. Oh, Father, help us to glorify our great King, for we ask these things in his name. Amen.